Hi, welcome to my part 3 of my review for the Vampire the Masquerade 20th Anniversary Edition core rulebook. This time I'm going to talk about the domains of the dead, the mythology of the damned, and the other denizens of the world of darkness. The different societies or domains are going to be radically different depending on the sect that is ruling that particular society or domain. Usually those places ruled by the Camarilla, for example, feel quite civilized and less obvious when compared to places ruled by the Sabbath, the Sabbath embrace the beast. So as you can see, there is this contrast of civilization and savagery within the urban environment. Remember, the wilderness belongs to other denizens of the world of darkness. Let's talk about the Camarilla first. The prince is probably the most important figure. Although there are princes that are puppets or figureheads, there are some others that are quite powerful, feared and respected. Some are even tyrants, absolute monarchs of the damned, that rule with all of their power and with no consideration as to the way they can abuse their power or their influence. A prince has many duties and privileges, but the priority is enforcing the traditions, most importantly the masquerade, to keep the kindred, the vampires, safe from the threat of humanity. That is, this facilitates the ability or the capacity for a vampire to prey upon humans. But for example, if we were to talk about the Sabbath, just to make a sharper contrast, you would have an archbishop that works as a sort of like cult leader and warlord if needed, to advance the sort of Cain's agenda. They want to rule openly over mankind, over the kine, as the vampires call them. And they also want to stop, or at the very least, frustrate the plans of the antediluvians and perhaps even the Methuselahs. It all depends. Although there are some Methuselahs that are also interested in furthering the agenda of the Sabbath. In the case of other sects, for example, although they do not give you too much detail when it comes to this chapter 1, you do get some information on the other movements. For example, the Anarch movement has a Baron, and the Baron is supposed to be the antithesis, or you could say the counterbalance to the Prince and the Archbishop. The Baron is essentially a leader of freedom fighters. However, it is not uncommon for a Baron to become corrupt as well. Let's talk about some other titles in the Camarilla. You have Harpies. They are basically opinion leaders. They are those that sway the vampire crowds, the groups of kindred towards certain trends and ideologies. So they are not to be underestimated, although they have no official power. They are almost unofficially elected. And if they overstep their boundaries, a prince could get tired of them and the harpy could end up suffering final death. Perhaps through the blood hunt. And then we have the Keeper of Elysium. Now, I think I mentioned this in the other parts of my review. And Elysium is basically like a truce or a neutral ground where kindred can meet. Vampires can talk without that fear of getting attacked, with what is expected of jihad. But that is also, it doesn't mean that you should lower your guard during Elysium, because many vampires try to take advantage of Elysium to get the upper hand over their rivals. But the Keeper of the Elysium is in charge of seeing that the Elysium is carried out without incident. And then you have the Scourge. In this time, which many elders believe to be the time of thin blood, the Scourge is responsible for destroying those vampires of 14th and higher generation. Now, there isn't always a Scourge trying to exterminate vampires of thinner blood, but there are princes that consider them to be a necessary evil, so to speak, so that perhaps the prophecy of Gehenna does not come to pass, because it's told in the Book of Nod that at the time of the thin blood, where vampires of 14th or higher generations appear that have little to no vampiric powers or disciplines, and that they seem almost unrelated to what is expected or what is considered to be an orthodox undead lineage, the Scourge is needed to destroy those vampires of thin blood. And then you have the Sheriff. The Sheriff works like the prince's right hand. He is responsible for the physical enforcement of princely decree. Some can be quite diligent, disciplined, and intelligent, and others are just thugs who like to abuse their authority and power. It all depends on what the prince wants to achieve in his particular domain. The Sheriff is also assisted by hounds, that is, vampires that should assist the Sheriff in his particular appointed task. And then you have the Primogen. Now, the Primogen is somewhat of a flexible title. They feel a bit unofficial at times, and they don't have a rigid structure. They are basically like advisors that represent particular clans in any meeting that the prince decides to undertake or carry out. Sometimes there are a number of individuals of each clan, and the princes encourage this so that there are still enmities and rivalries within different clans, so that they don't think of dethroning the prince. So sometimes it's in the best interest of the prince to create division within the different clans, so that they fight each other and they don't have time to think on how to overcome a certain ruling structure. And then you have the Justicar. Now, these work as the judges, while the Sheriff is a bit more on the enforcing side of things. The Justicar is there to punish those that have violated the traditions, but they are somewhat less durable in their position, in their term, because they usually serve for 13 years and they are usually changed for another Justicar, while the Sheriff could last there perhaps decades or hundreds of years. They usually have those that assist them in their task. They are known as Archons. Now, Archons are those that assist, as I was telling you, the Justicar. And just because a Justicar has left his position, it doesn't mean that the Archon has to leave. Perhaps the new Justicar likes a particular Archon, so he could choose that vampire to keep enforcing a particular law. And then you have the Alastor. Now, while the Sheriffs and the Archons and the Justicars are more open in their enforcement of the different traditions and agencies, Alastors are the secret police of vampires. They work behind the curtains, hidden in the shadows, and sometimes they are so difficult to pinpoint or locate that sometimes even the princes do not know of their existence. They could be assigned by other powers, and the Alastors are quite feared because the prince, and during many occasions, he is quite impotent when it comes to removing an Alastor or giving orders to that particular Alastor. The Alastor could be one of the most dangerous pieces to consider in the game of the Jihad when focusing on a particular domain and a prince. And then you have the inner circle. This is the true hub of the Camarilla. This group meets once every 13 years to plan out the different business directions, what type of path or course the vampire society is going to take. And it basically decides the doings of the entire kindred as a race. Each clan is permitted one representative, usually the eldest member of a particular clan. Now let's talk about the Sabbat and their titles. You have Doctus. Now basically, to understand the structure of the Sabbat are almost entirely uncivilized. They could be considered more like packs of animals. Perhaps even tribes in their more loose sense, but they are, in that sense, they are more tribalistic or savage. So the Doctus is basically a leader of an individual pack. So this group of individuals, the Docti, they attend and regulate operations concerning the different packs. And just like in the Camarilla, if we were to talk about the Harpies as their counterparts, the Docti, they are quite indispensable or unnecessary. That is, a prince could get rid quite easily of a Doctus if he doesn't obey his orders. And then you have the pack priests. They bear the responsibility for the spiritual well-being of the different packs. They are second in command to the Docti. So they are that, let's say, the spiritual or morale-based aspect of the packs. Then you have Templars that are kind of like the paladins, the elite force of bodyguards appointed by bishops or greater leaders. And then you have the bishops themselves. They are those immediately below the archbishop. And the bishop is usually in charge of a single aspect of Cainite unlife in the domain. Some Sabbat domains have no archbishop, but sometimes they are ruled by a council of bishops. So as you can see, there is a lot of power play involved here. Maybe a group of bishops could band together to dethrone an archbishop and take control. And then you have the Priscus. Now this is somewhat similar to the Primogen, but a Priscus is never appointed by an archbishop or a bishop. They rise in rank over time and according to no specific criteria. It's also important to consider that in the Sabbat, they consider power plays and usurpers to be quite admirable as long as they are intelligent and powerful in the way that they take control of things. So it's not unusual for example, a Priscus to rise up the ranks go up the ranks when taking advantage of a Sabbat vampire that lowered his guard. And then you have cardinals. Now they oversee the affairs of the Sabbat in large geographical regions. There's quite a bit of responsibility when it comes to being a cardinal. And it is their direct duty to bring any cities within their territory under the Sabbat's sway. So if there's a particular city that is being taken over by the Camarilla, it's up to the cardinals to take back that city. And then you have the regent. The regent is the ultimate authority over all of the Sabbat. He rules the entire sect, and almost every other leader in the Sabbat has to inform him of everything that he or she is doing, how things are turning up, and they could also be forcibly removed by the regent. Now let's talk about the mythology of the damned. There is a lot of controversy when it comes to the mythology and origin of vampires. As I mentioned in the other parts of my review, most of the vampires consider that their progenitor is Cain, but some of them think that maybe this is more a bit more pragmatic and less folkloric than it is actually believed. Nonetheless, it is part of the tradition to continue spreading the message of the Book of Nod, where vampires can learn of their history of Cain and the first vampires. Now let's talk about the first vampire, the first murderer, Cain. Some consider Cain to be damned, and others consider him to be blessed. As many of you know, in biblical times, God asked for a sacrifice. So while Abel performed sacrifices that had to do with vegetables and animals, according to this biblical interpretation, Cain considered that his most precious thing to sacrifice was his brother Abel. But others said that he was actually jealous of Abel, that he was perhaps favored by God, so that he killed him to usurp his position. So this is where things get quite messy, because it could be believed that it is all written in code, and that it didn't actually happen, that it should be considered like a story to represent different aspects, different wrong paths to take. Perhaps they shouldn't have sacrificed anyone to start with, or perhaps the sacrifice represented some other thing entirely, or perhaps Cain did actually hate Abel and that's why he killed him, or perhaps Cain, in a bizarre act of love, killed Abel. But the point is that God became quite angry at Cain, so he cursed him with vampirism. Although, as I was telling you, maybe God was pleased with Cain and he gave him these awesome vampiric powers. So this is a point of debate for many kindred. Those take this story as history, others consider it a fantasy or a delusion. Others consider it to be, as I was telling you, something written in code, and that it shouldn't be taken literally so. But regardless, Cain is usually considered the strongest vampire, the first vampire who wandered the land of Nod, and he continued passing on his curse because he felt quite lonely being the only vampire in existence. Eventually he created 3 other vampires. If legend is to be believed, he embraced Enoch, Irad, and Scylla, and so then began the 3rd generation. And as I was telling you, you can get a lot more information about this in the Book of Nod. There's also a very interesting encounter between Cain and a hag, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding this. This is quite interesting and can serve as powerful fuel for stories and chronicles. So Cain kept creating vampires, and cities were founded and shaped by the different plans of the vampires that he created. But Cain mysteriously disappeared. Some vampires have said that Cain appears every now and then because he was cursed by God to wander the earth. They see him during different periods of history, but there's never hard evidence that they actually saw him. It's just like a rumor or a legend. So that's also part of the mystery. Now, the closest you are to Cain in terms of generation, that is, vampires of lower generation, 3rd and 4th generation, etc., are surely the most powerful vampires in existence, unless Cain himself exists. But as you can see, that there could be some gaps in generation. Is Cain the 1st generation vampire, or is he generation 0? And what about the mysterious 2nd generation? And how many 3rd generation vampires are there really? There are many legends, myths, lies, and half-truths that can be explored in the different stories and chronicles. But something is quite obvious for vampires. The lower your generation, the more powerful that you are. There are certain vampiric disciplines, dark, miraculous effects that can only be performed or carried out by vampires of lower generations. And then there is the act of diablerie, also known as the amaranth. Diablerie, at times it could be considered the lowest and the most terrible crime that a vampire can commit by draining another vampire completely of his blood, or vitae as it is also known, and taking the power of that generation. For example, if you were to drain a 5th generation vampire of all of his blood, you would effectively become a 5th generation vampire, gaining all of his power. And in fact, there are some powerful vampires that have obtained their power through Diablerie. So this is considered a crime. Only the Sabbat sometimes consider it an act that it was worth it. In fact, they could think that vampires, supposedly powerful vampires that were the victims of Diablerie, were actually foolish and weak, because if they were actually as wise and as intelligent and as powerful as they were supposed to be, they would have never been caught unawares or off guard by these usurpers. So as you can see, this act of Diablerie can also be used as a focal point for stories and chronicles. Now let's talk about the different generations. The second generation is quite mysterious. In the Chronicles of Nod, Cain embraced these unknowable ancients to dwell with him in his great city of Enoch and give him succor. So these second generation vampires, traditionally they are few, at most 3, but perhaps there could be more vampires. And then we have the third generation vampires that are the founding fathers of the 13 great clans. And here things get quite messy and confusing, because some say that there are many other founding fathers, to put it in a way. There are other unknown clans or mysterious clans that it's quite impossible to pinpoint the exact founder of a particular bloodline, but they are still a source of fear. These third generation vampires are supposed to rise up, appear from their hiding places, and devour vampires during Gehenna. And then we have the 4th and 5th generation vampires. They are known as the Methuselahs, and they are quite powerful, extremely powerful. They only serve to enhance that fear of the 3rd generation vampires, because some 4th and 5th generation vampires are almost like demigods in their powers. So if they are actually that terrible, you can imagine that 3rd generation vampires are probably unbeatable. And what about Cain himself? In one of the 2 video games of Vampire the Masquerade for the PC, you actually get to fight Methuselah. That's pretty cool. Now the 6th, 7th and 8th generation vampires are also quite powerful. Not as much as the lower generations, of course, but they have accumulated a lot of power and knowledge throughout the years. A lot of them have been during the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and then when it comes to 9th and 10th generation vampires, they have experienced other dramatic changes. For example, perhaps the Industrial Revolution and different radical changes in technology, in culture and society throughout the world. And remember, just because time passes by, it doesn't mean that that vampire has to be born in that particular period, because there could be a 6th generation vampire who has embraced perhaps almost no kindred and has created no kindred, and then 300 or 400 years in the future he decides to embrace someone. So you could find a 6th generation vampire that was embraced during the 1900s, perhaps a bit before or a bit later. So it all depends on context. And the 11th, 12th and 13th generations of vampires are those that are in modern times. This is people of our current period that are quite knowledgeable in the rapid changes of technology, of the progression and development of science and different types of governments. So they are quite weak when it comes to their supernatural powers. If we were to compare them perhaps with the vampires of the 6th generation or even ninth generation, but they have the advantage of being quite knowledgeable in every technological advantage of the modern era. Now, when it comes to the 14th and 15th generations, as I was telling you, a lot of them are quite weak. Some of them almost feel human, just with a slight advantage when it comes to being a vampire, a bit more hardy, tougher to kill. But some of them, there are also rumors that some of them have actually had children, not children, that is, they haven't created vampires, but they are capable of having babies. So a lot of vampires consider this kindred to be an aberration and a sign that the apocalypse, that the Gehenna is nigh. Gehenna is a source of fear for almost all kindred. Only the most cynical and materialistic as you can get in a world of vampires, only them, they dismiss Gehenna as perhaps as a boogeyman, but most of the vampires consider it to be something that will happen. Not a question of if, but when. So many are preparing for this event, but for the most part, they want to stop it. Gehenna is something that almost all of the sects and clans fear or take as a point of focus for their agendas and perhaps the resolution of the jihad. There is a glimmer of hope, very small glimmer of hope, which is Golconda. Golconda is a state of enlightenment, of vampiric enlightenment, something beyond vampirism. With Golconda, a vampire effectively becomes immortal. To the point that is, a vampire is already immortal in that as long as he has blood, enough people to feed upon, he can last forever, technically speaking. But with Golconda, it is said that these vampires require little to no blood from mortals. They are seen as virtuous vampires, and whose purpose or objective is impossible to figure out. And the exact steps to reach Golconda are the source of myth, the stuff of myth and legend. There is no guideline or a book or manual to reach Golconda. It's something that is a vampire has to figure out for him or herself. Perhaps that could also be the point of a story or a chronicle. Now let's talk about the other denizens of the world of darkness, because vampires are not the only ones that prowl the night with their plans. Many of these denizens of darkness, if not all of them, have their own games in the old world of darkness mythology. We have the hunters. Hunters are basically all humans that hunt or try to slay the creatures of the night. Any supernatural thing, be it vampires, werewolves, wraiths, etc. Some of them use very conventional weapons. They use powerful esoteric symbols with faith, but some others have surprising supernatural powers. Although you feel like these supernatural powers are natural in the sense that they use them instinctively. It's like a hidden talent that they have, that they suddenly can produce flaming swords out of nowhere, or that they can paralyze supernatural beings with their commands. So hunters are a bit of a thing of mystery and threat for vampires. And the game Hunter the Reckoning is also quite cool, and you get a lot of information of why exactly the hunters exist. They are seen as almost as the ultimate warriors of humanity, those that hunt the night, to put it in a way. And then you have werewolves. Werewolves and vampires remain a mystery to each other as well. Vampires consider werewolves to be akin to wild beasts that just hunt vampires, like any predator would hunt their particular prey. But werewolves have their own vision of things, their cosmology. In fact, werewolves consider vampires to be servants of urban decadence. related to the Weaver, and maybe one of these days I will talk about Werewolf the Apocalypse. And so werewolves are the default enemies of vampires, as they represent the purest or more savage aspect of the wilderness. In fact, some werewolves can actually travel between dimensions, to put it in a way. And then you have the Magi. Now the Magi are what you would expect. All of those humans, if they can still be considered to be so, that through study or practicing different occult and esoteric disciplines and rituals, they have reached that state where they can actually produce matter and energy out of nowhere. They could incinerate a vampire using the proper spell, or with a thought they could shape or reshape or destroy aspects of reality. So Magi are also a thing to be feared, and they have somewhat of a fascination when it comes to vampires. Magi could be more focused on capturing a vampire and studying that vampire rather than destroying. That is studying that vampire to unearth some occult secrets rather than just destroying kindred. And then you have the wild ones. These are all the fairy folk, all of those creatures and spirits of nature. They have two opposing courts, and they're not too interested in vampires, but if vampires meddle too much, or their plans and plots somehow become an obstacle to what the fairies or the wild ones have in store or want for the world around them, the vampires could become the target of their deadly pranks. And then you have ghosts. Now, these are quite common because vampires, they kill a lot of humans, sometimes during the conflicts of the jihad, or when they take too much blood from them. Ghosts are those spirits that are perhaps in pain and misery and have some unfulfilled purpose related to revenge or love. And if a vampire becomes the target of a ghost, it's quite difficult for that vampire to defend himself or herself from such wraith attacks. So they usually have to talk to someone like a member of the Giovanni clan, or the Tremere, or the True Black Hand, anyone who is knowledgeable in necromancy or some sort of theurgy or some other occult means to get rid of these ghosts. And there are many other creatures, supernatural and natural, that could present an obstacle to vampires, although the most powerful ones, of course, are on the supernatural side of things, such as demons, devils, shapeshifters, mummies, etc., anything related to weird science and the occult. So vampires do not have it easy. Now, at the end of this chapter, you have a lexicon. These are basically all of the words that kindred use, that vampires use to refer to different concepts that they simply have no place in human dialect because they're specific to the vampire way of life or unlife. You have common parlance such as the barrens, the areas of a city unfit for life, including graveyards, abandoned buildings, industrial wastelands, and areas of irreversible urban blight. You also have some other things like the final death, when a vampire ceases to exist, crossing the line from undeath into death. Or you have the kiss, to drink blood, especially from a mortal. The kiss causes feelings of ecstasy in those who receive it. You also have older forms of parlance or speech. These older forms are usually only used by elders or vampires that want to get closer to the traditions, but younger vampires, for example anarchs, look down upon these older methods of communication, older forms or styles. So you have things like the Ancile, a proven vampire between the elders and the neonates. The plural is Ancile. But you also have Domitor, a ghoul's master, one who feeds her blood and issues her commands. We will talk a bit more about ghouls later on, but a ghoul is basically a human that has taken a bit of vampire blood. That is, a person drinks vampire blood and he or she gains some sort of minor supernatural powers, but at the same time, that ghoul becomes the servant of a vampire. And then you have other words such as siren, a vampire who seduces mortals in order to drink from them, and then only takes a small quantity of blood so as to avoid killing them. You also have vulgar argot. These terms are slang. This is basically an attempt for younger vampires, particularly anarchs, that try to create their own way of communication, their own parlance or protocols. So you have words such as alicat, a vampire who keeps no permanent haven, but sleeps in a different location each night. This term also refers to a vampire who feeds exclusively from the homeless, vagrants, and other elements of low society. You have other things, for example, blood dolls. A blood doll is a mortal who freely gives her blood to a vampire. Most blood dolls gain a perverse satisfaction from the kiss and actively seek out vampires who will take their vitae, or their blood. And you also have some more derogatory terms like juice bag, a contemptuous term for mortals, indicating that their sole use is for subsistence. Also juice box. Now, depending on the type of social circles in which a vampire moves or interacts with, some of these terms could be considered more prestigious, and sometimes those same prestigious terms could be considered vulgar, and as I was telling you, like the vulgar argot, but usually by elders in that case, and other times they just feel neutral. And you have a lot of terms, so you will have to look this up during different stories and chronicles, but I have heard of people who have memorized all of the forms of communication of vampires. And so that is it for this part of this review. Next time, I will go deeper into the secrets of the sects and their organizations and their plans. Thanks for watching this part of my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. I will see you soon.